As usual, your company from week to week is very much appreciated. We will be having a discussion today on disaster preparedness. Of course, we look all over the world, in the region, outside of the region, and we see what is happening. Just recently, we have seen a spate of floodings in Europe and in Asia, flooding like we have never seen before. In other places, temperatures are soaring, causing droughts, forest fires, and other weather calamities. We cannot underscore enough the importance of preparing for disasters. Disasters can be sudden. They just come upon us without much warning. And sometimes there is warning. Nonetheless, we have to be in a constant state of readiness in order to mitigate the impact of any disaster that befalls us. We are in the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. It is a season that in the Caribbean it comes around every year. And while there are times when we do not really suffer the impact of any hurricane, sometimes some islands escape within the Caribbean the impact of these weather phenomena on a yearly basis, others are impacted. And the difference between the impact and what happens in terms of damage to property, loss of life, damage to infrastructure, all goes back to education. It is important that people are aware. Environmental awareness is extremely important, especially given where we are, our geographic location in the world. We can also have tsunamis and earthquakes. We are on the Caribbean plate. We can only think of Haiti in 2010 that suffered a massive earthquake that to this day, Haiti has not fully recovered from that earthquake in Port-au-Principe. Now, I have with me today persons who will enlighten us in terms of disaster preparedness, or let me use a broad term, disaster management, which of course includes the preparedness also. I do have with me Mrs. Ulrika Lennon-Petty, and Mrs. Petty is the planning officer at the National Emergency Management Agency, what we call NEMA. Welcome, Mrs. Petty.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
I also have Major Coyote Sutton, who, of course, as you know, he's one of the big wigs at the St. Kitts and Nevis Defense Force. However, he's here today in his capacity as the chair of the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee. He has been delegated by the commander of the St. Kitts and Nevis Defense Force, Commander Comrie, as the chair of that subcommittee. Of course, the National Emergency Operation Center, there are, I think, 10 subcommittees, and each subcommittee deals with a specific area having to do with disaster management. About 2 weeks ago, We had on the program the Housing and Shelter Subcommittee, and we had also the management aspect of it, the PS Janelle Louis Tafari, and the Housing and Shelter Committee, Mr. Valentine Lindsay. They were here just recently. Now, NEMA. Mrs. Langley Stevens, who is the Deputy National Disaster Coordinator, explained to us recently that NEMA is not just about hurricanes. At one point, people thought that it was the Hurricane Agency, that is the only disaster or hazard that NEMA was preoccupied with. But NEMA is about comprehensive disaster management. Mrs. Petty, what is your role at NEMA?
So I am the planning officer at NEMA, and basically in a nutshell, I am responsible for liaising with the 10 national disaster subcommittees which you alluded to in your introduction. And I'm the liaison between the subcommittee and the agency. I am here to just make sure that the national disaster subcommittees remain ready year-round, not just during the hurricane season, as of course we are not a hurricane agency. We are comprehensive disaster management agency, and so we function year-round around the disaster management cycle. I'm also the Geographic Information Systems Officer at NEMA. Layman's term, I deal with hazard mapping and as well as any preparedness, pre-impact and post-impact information that needs to be spatially mapped and spatially visualized. I also manage that, and I do that in collaboration with the Department of Physical Planning, as they do assist us greatly.
Right. Now, Mrs. Petty, you have a very important role at NEMA. Mr. Major Sutton, you are the chair of the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee. What does your role involve?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. The Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee is a composite part of the National Disaster Management Committee. And we are engaged with the preparedness for when a disaster hits the Federation, and then we can mobilize the different units within the subcommittee to function effectively, to respond immediately. We are the first subcommittee to go into action upon impact by any disaster or crisis. So pretty much that's what we do. We plan for it, we train for it, we coordinate, we test what we have, and plug up all the gaps so that we are ready.
Okay, tell me a little bit about the search and rescue. What is there to be searched for? What is there to be rescued? Just like you said in your opening statement, there are some disasters that you cannot prepare for, and there are some disasters that don't give you adequate pre-warnings. So you have to, if you plan for it, you know how many people are supposed to be there. For example, you know how many children are in the school, going to school on a daily basis. And then if you want to plan for a disaster response in that regard, you know how many vehicles you're going to have in place, you know if you're going to prepare food and so on, But in a situation where you don't know, you have to anticipate, you have to prepare properly, you have to train, and
then, you know, this situation remains fluid when the disaster hits. And then you just, you know, implement what you've already prepared. And since this is not the first time we're doing it, we are quite proficient in it. I can go further to say that the St. Kitts Nevis Defense Force, every hurricane season has hurricane orders, whereby the different units within the Defense Force are tasked with different responsibilities, and every single person within the Defense Force entirely has a clear responsibility. They know exactly what their responsibilities are. Now, but what we deal with on the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee is on a national level. So we merge what we have with other agencies that fall under the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee. And those agencies are the police, the fire department, the customs, the Air and Seaport Authority, you know, public sector, the health, you know, and the list goes on. Electricity, water, they all fall on that initial subcommittee. So we're able to first make an assessment of, you know, the damages, especially to the critical infrastructures, and then we are, you know, able to advise the management committee on the extent of damage and so forth. Road clearance is also part of it. Clearing the runway at the airport, we have teams for that, so that if we are expecting relief, the runways are safe, the airport is safe. If we're expecting deliveries through the seaport, everything is in place, it's adequate, you know, you have all the manpower required to facilitate the relief supplies and all that. So it's a comprehensive committee with a lot of responsibilities, and we are up to the task.
Yes, Major Sutton, what are some of the equipment that are necessary for search and rescue? Because the equipment that you have for search and rescue are crucial.
Yes, indeed. Now, part of the subcommittee, as I mentioned earlier, is the St. Kitts Nevis Fire and Rescue Services. They are part of the subcommittee. Now, they have a lot of various equipment for various types of search and rescue, be it collapsed building, be it you know, somebody falling off a tree or something, trapped in a vehicle and all that. So we collaborate, and also NEMA has some equipment. It might be chainsaws, we have to cut things. It might be the Jaw of Life, you know, the fire and rescue services use those equipment. So we have a number of equipment that is essential to effectively carry out search and rescue. But I would say that, you know, you cannot have enough. You can never have enough equipment. But what we do is we, you know, try to make an assessment of what we need, and then put the requisition through, and we get them. Sometimes when we have trade winds, disaster relief is part of HADR, is part of trade winds. And through that avenue, sometimes we're able to, you know, acquire some necessary equipment to carry out effective search and rescue. So some of the equipments, like I mentioned, you know, the Jaw of Life, you have even ropes, some certain kinds of ropes. You have what they use in the Coast Guard, they call Jacob's ladder. Those things come effective when you are trying to rescue people from, you know, some depth. You can throw down the ladder, secure it, and then the person you're about to rescue is able to climb up. We have, you know, litters. We call it litter. That's to carry people that are injured. We've done that a number of times in collaboration with the fire and rescue services, where tourists go into the forest to hike and they get lost, or they're trapped, or they fall and they injure themselves. And, we get called. And sometimes we have to send soldiers out there. I remember a situation where we had to send soldiers out there to the crater. They had to actually stay overnight, with the person. So the soldiers stay there until in the morning, first light, then they effect the rescue of the person. And the person was dehydrated, they were able to revive the person and so forth. So those are some of the things that we do.
For example, in terms of transport, and depending on certain areas where a person is, do you have any sort of a backup? For example, do we have helicopters to rescue people? For example, we don't have helicopters, but do we have backup? For example, close your neighbors that we can call for assistance?
Yes, we do. If depending on what the situation is, you have the regional security system. Of course, you might say, well, the regional security system is going to deploy from Barbados here, but it's not the only agency within the region that we collaborate with. You have the MRCC, which is the Marine Center in Martinique. They also have units in St. Martin. They will have such assets. You also have the U.S. Coast Guard in Puerto Rico. I mean, it might sound far, but if we need it, we can always tap into those resources. And, most times they come into our rescue. They have come into our rescue. So, but we have been fortunate not to require, aircraft, airlift from wherever in the mountains. What we do is sometimes it's tedious. The airlift would have been the easiest way to go. But since we know that, it's going to take time and it's not readily available, we try to implement make-up systems. So maybe this is the time now that the powers that be are listening. Perhaps we need an air wing in the St. Kitts Nevis Defense Force so that we can effect certain things. Our neighbors in Antigua and Barbuda are getting air wing right now. So perhaps we should start to think of that as well.
For example, an air ambulance sometimes become critical in search and rescue because a person is injured and in need of medical attention. And that becomes very critical in terms of, because the whole idea of the search and rescue is that of saving lives.
Is to be able to get the person that needs help quickly and be able to give them that life support that they need immediately. And it's not just rescuing someone from the hills. You can also, air rescue can come useful when you're rescuing people from the sea as well. We have sea rescue as well, with the Coast Guard. So you can quickly airlift the victim to get adequate medical help. And another thing is that we try to ensure that all Defense Force personnel are first aid certified, trained, so that at least they can give that basic care before the professionals get there.
And so your work is very critical, not just at the time of a hurricane, but a disaster, an emergency can happen at any time where your subcommittee is called into play.
It can happen at a cricket match. God forbid, the infrastructure collapses, or there is a stampede. We have to get in and try to coordinate, because there will be panic. So you have to get to work quickly and set things in motion, mobilize, set things in motion, and take control of the situation so that you don't have, you don't extend the number of victims And those that are already victims, before you get there, you try to, give them the necessary medical care that they need to stay alive until they can get to, the professionals.
What can be some of the factors that can impede your search and rescue operations?
Weather can impede search and rescue operations. Not having all the resources that we require can also impede it. We also, where you have crowd, because once you have a situation like that developing, even though it is critical, it is dangerous, you still find people wanting to congregate and to see firsthand what is going on. Everybody wants to come out with their phone to take videos and pictures. All those activities can impede it doesn't make the environment safe for those who have to work. But critical to the efficiency or efficacy of the responsibilities of the committee will be, I would say, adequate resources and weather permitting. You can want to rescue as much as you want to. You have all the good intent, but the weather does not permit you. Then you really can't do too much. An example is the situation in the Creator, when the gentleman, who went there with good intent, exploring St. Kitts, and fortunately got injured and couldn't make it back up. And we couldn't get him, so that we couldn't get him out that night because we didn't want to exacerbate his problems and perhaps also create more injuries with the soldiers that are trying to rescue. So you stay there overnight. And, soldiers, is a soldier life. We bash out, and in the morning, first light, you get the gentleman out. And, so weather is critical, and adequate resources are also critical.
What would be some of the factors, again, why you would call off a search and rescue? Sometimes you're searching and you're rescuing, and then a decision has to be made that the search and rescue have come to an end.
To call off a search and rescue is usually a very, very difficult decision to make, especially when you don't have all the information and you don't want to leave the area, and then you are that close to the person that you're supposed to rescue, and then you leave the person alone. So it's a critical decision point, which is not usually arrived at easily. We exhaust all possibilities before you actually, call it off. And you take into consideration how long is that person going to, can stay hydrated. If the person, maybe they lose their voice, they're not able to shout, you employ all the necessary technology that is out there. You have all the thermal seeking equipment. We have drones now that we use to fly over areas to see if we can identify persons, especially if it's not, say it's getting dark and you just want to be able to identify where the person is, or weather not permitting, but you can fly the drone. You can cover a larger area than the normal human eye. So we employ all the available resources, all the technology that is out there, and if we don't get through, then you still give some time of grace and do it over again. And then if you're not successful, then you've exhausted all the possibilities. Then you have to make that call. But until all the possibilities are exhausted, and I can give examples too. I used to work in the Coast Guard when we do search and rescue. You take into consideration the wind, you take into consideration the current, directions, you take into consideration how much fuel these people have, how large is the vessel, how far could it have drifted, which area. So you take the chart, you're plotting out grids where, taking into consideration all this, you can work out the distance and the speed at which the vessel will drift and so forth. So you say, okay, if they lost control at this point, by this time they should be in this general area. So you exhaust all that, and then you can walk back from wherever, walk back to the last point of contact. Walk back and then go again and exhaust it. Sometimes, we get lucky, and sometimes we don't, because the calculations are just their calculations based on science. But sometimes science is not perfect. So, the wind change sometime and it takes them elsewhere. So that's why we, normally employ, air search and rescue teams, especially say from Puerto Rico, from the U.S. Coast Guard in Puerto Rico, or from MRCC in Martinique, to fly over the area and be able to. There are numerous examples I can relate to, where you think, oh, we really can't find these people and so on. But a small craft, sometimes you don't see them, and they ride in the waves and the troughs and so on, and you miss them. But in most cases, we've been successful. But again, it goes back to what I said earlier: is having the required resources. Aircraft is one of them. So maybe, Mr. Williams, you can,
Right. You speak in terms of the resources, but if you have the resources, you need people who are trained in order to use these resources. What type of training is offered for search and rescue teams, for example, here in St. Kitts, for the search, rescue, and so on? People need training in that area. What sort of training is offered?
Okay, I believe that Ms. Petty can add something, can inject some, but I will give you a little piece here. We coordinate local training. We coordinate training within the Defense Force, because we have individuals, personnel within the Defense Force who have been adequately trained in such capacity. We also have exercise trade winds, which is also a training opportunity. So we try to get as many people trained as possible, not just within the Defense Force, the police force, and the entire general public, the communities. We are able to source training through regional agencies as well. I don't want to take over Ms. Petty's responsibilities, but SEDIMA and all these other agencies within the region, they coordinate regional training, and they, be it in these days where it's COVID, the pandemic, a lot of training have been done, virtually. But normally, you have scheduled regional training that is held across the region in different countries. RSS is one. RSS is able to source training from either the EU or the US. They confront these agencies and are able to get them. Also, SEDIMA and NEMA. NEMA coordinates a lot of training as well. That's why I said Ms. Petty would be the ideal person to add to that.
Ms. Petty, is there anything you want to add to what he has said?
I can add a bit. I think he touched a bit on each area. The agency normally hold tabletop exercises. In fact, we actually recently did Carib Wave, a tsunami-based exercise that we participate in annually. And because of COVID-19, of course, we couldn't do it physically as we normally would, and so we had it virtually. And Search and Rescue Initial Clearance Subcommittee was able to participate in that one. So we don't just do hurricane exercises. We also, I think recently, I think it was 2 years ago, there was a mass casualty training, and members from the Search and Rescue National Disaster Subcommittee was involved in that one as well. And as Major Sutton alluded to, the RSS, CDEMA, and our regional partners always provide training opportunities for the subcommittees and their members.
Right. Now, Mrs. Petty, the Geographic Information System within disaster management, could you explain what that is and tell us the importance of that?
Okay. So Geographic Information System, it's, in a nutshell, it's mapping. We currently use softwares like ArcGIS and QGIS, which is a newer, freer platform, to spatially reference information and have them visualized on a map of St. Kitts and Nevis. And we do that for hazards that, such as volcano and tsunami, storm surge, landslides, just to name a few, and we do for both St. Kitts and Nevis. The importance of having GIS within disaster management is that you are able to, it's not only just for, it's for preparedness, education, pre-impact, during impact, and post-impact, and I'll go through each of those. Preparedness in the fact that we do these maps for hazards to show and educate persons how a specific hazard, for example, a tsunami, would impact St. Kitts and Nevis. We do it for the a possible volcanic eruption as well, where your safe zones. If you're in the red zone, do you know you're in the red zone, and where would you go if you got a evacuation notice that you're in the red zone, the volcano is active, you need to evacuate. So we do that for education. We also do it as a part of preparedness efforts. For example, right now I'm engaged in a project with doing some mapping for the prepositioning of personnel for the damage assessment National Disaster Subcommittee, as well as their equipment, and that will become important if we have to activate, so that we can know where persons would be positioned to respond to after the impact of a tropical cyclone. And so Geographic Information System is not just about mapping, it's about representing specific hazards, representing information using history, because history plays a big part in it. You know, if you had incidences of flooding in the past, then you would spatially reference those to show that this is a possible area that may flood again in the future.
Okay. So the information system is extremely important within the whole disaster management. Now, one of the critical things in disaster management is knowing in terms of vulnerable areas, because with the vulnerable areas, you have people who are vulnerable to the impact of the disaster. Now, what is the importance of really knowing where these vulnerable areas are?
Okay, so the importance of knowing the vulnerable areas, and I'm going to use hurricane as an example since we are in the hurricane season. We are told that a hurricane is on its way to St. Kitts and Nevis, and you live on the Bayfront, for example, in Bastille. You know that the Bayfront have a history of flooding from storm surge. And so if you know that your house is in that area, that vulnerable area that is susceptible to flooding, then you know you're one of those persons who would need to evacuate to someplace safer until the threat has passed. And so we use GIS to spatially reference those based on storm surge data that we would have collected throughout the years. And so you know the vulnerable communities would be, for storm surge, for example, the coastal communities with the Bastille Bay Road, New Guinea, Half-a-Tree, to name a few. In terms of the vulnerable persons, the vulnerable population now, there was a situation in 2017 during the impact of Tropical Storm Irma, a call was made to the NEOC, and the call was that a vulnerable person within our community, their house was impacted, and they needed to get out to a safer location. However, when the search and rescue team went out to find that person, they of course they found them in the end, but at first it was a bit difficult pinpointing their exact location, and so from that it was recognized the importance of knowing where the vulnerable population resides. And vulnerable population includes the elderly, those with some sort of physical impediment that may impede them from assisting themselves during a time of emergency. And so, in partnership with the social services, we began spatially referencing those vulnerable populations, and we actually were able to use that data during the first response of COVID-19 last year during the lockdowns, because we needed to know which communities had the more vulnerable populations, specifically those living alone, as well as homeless persons where they usually frequent. And so we saw the use of those maps during COVID last year, so we were able to test and see where we need to go back to the drawing board to refine our information.
Right, and the vulnerability many times is really linked to a number of factors. It can be linked to people below the poverty line, people who are poor. It can be linked, and because they are poor, their living conditions and the infrastructure, their living infrastructure is susceptible to the weather elements.
Yes, and that's where the district managers come in, because the district managers are our volunteers in the NEMA mechanism, and they are the eyes and ears within their respective communities. And so each year they do walk-arounds in their community, interacting with persons that they know are vulnerable, not only physically, but maybe because they are below the poverty line, as you mentioned, Mr. Williams. And so they would be able to report to the agency and pinpoint those persons. And the list, when it's updated, it is shared with the district managers to make sure that we do not leave anyone off the list, because, of course, we do not want to leave anyone behind.
And, for example, even within the COVID-19 situation, there are some persons who are more vulnerable than others because of their living conditions. And you see it basically in some countries where you have people who are very poor, and because they live in a lot of clusters and in such close proximity, they may not really have the amenities, for example, like running water and things like that, that is necessary for sanitation and all of that. It puts them more at risk for contracting diseases and that sort of a thing. So attention has to be paid really to the vulnerable population when it comes to disaster management. Now, what would be some of the challenges, Mrs. Petty, that you face with the vulnerable populations in terms of educating them, for example, when there is a disaster, what to do? Sometimes, for example, with a hurricane, there is need for them to be evacuated, to move to go somewhere else. What are some of the challenges, knowing that sometimes people are set in their ways, they don't want to move, and things like that?
I think that would always be a challenge, because, we promote that you should always be prepared and have a stock of food that would last you for at least 3 days for your family members, food, clothing, even money. And if you are living below your means, then, it would be difficult for us sometimes it's a bit difficult for us to go and tell persons, you should always have this amount of food on hand in case there's an emergency, because then the question is, but if I save this food for an emergency that may not happen, what will I eat today? And so, you know, we recognize those challenges, as well as having to tell someone that they have to move to a shelter. Sometimes it's difficult. You know, you're in a vulnerable area, you're going to be impacted by water, so we have to move you to a shelter. Some persons may not want to move from their houses because, I mean, it's their comfort. They're going into a situation that it's unknown, and they do not know how long they will be there for, the condition of their house when they get back to it. And so all of these are challenges that we face, but with disaster management, what would it be without these challenges, right? So.
Right, and another thing is they can be put people in a position of vulnerability, a language barrier whenever we have a disaster, or sometimes cultural differences. And it is about reaching people. So what methods do you employ to reach these vulnerable areas where people live? What are some of the methods that you employ? For example, if we have a language barrier, there's a problem there in terms of getting the message to this vulnerable population. What are some of the methods employed?
Well, some of the methods employed, as I mentioned, the district managers do go out to the community. There are some that are bilingual, and when they know that they will be going into an area where the population may not, or they may not speak English, then they make sure that there's someone present to translate for them. We actually did an exercise recently for Caribwave, where NEMA staff, the volunteers, as well as community policing actually went into the communities of Bastille, Newtown specifically, and we did make sure that we had someone to translate to Spanish, and so we were able to get the message across. And it was a conversation about tsunami, you know, asking if they're in the tsunami zone and stuff, and it was actually very successful, because we were able to, even though there was a language barrier, we still were able to get the message across and educate as we would. And so we try and make sure that the information that we have is inclusive. For example, the tsunami hazard maps, if you look at them, you would realize that they are in 3 languages, Spanish, French, and English. And so that's a part of our inclusive campaign.
Yes, they're in the language, but sometimes you may have people who are not able to read and read the maps, yes, and think. Mm-hmm. We do recognize
that. I know during COVID, the initial response last year, for example, they started translating some of the briefings into other languages. They would have met with the Haitian community here, as well as the Spanish community. Mr. Samuel, the National Disaster Coordinator, he is of Spanish background, so I think because of that, he especially was able to bring across the message more, and the importance of having this inclusivity when it comes to the language barriers that we may face when we are trying to educate and warn persons.
Right. Major Sutton, back to you. Some of your responsibilities, of course, would have to, the search and the rescue would have to do with, at some point, declaring that it's clear to come out. What do you call it, the all clear, the initial clearance, because sometimes when people think that the disaster is over, it's really not over. Sometimes there are downed lines, and people's life can still be placed in danger and so on. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. The responsibilities of the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee is categorized into the pre-disaster, during disaster, and after disaster. Okay. And they're not clear fit, as you know, as I've just categorized them. There are some that overlap, some responsibilities overlap, and so on. But it's just depending on, you know, what the situation is. If I could just go through some of the responsibilities. The pre-disaster is we design a contingency plan for search and rescue, for the various search and rescues. Okay, and then we also come up with an action plan that is known to all committee members and all the working groups. And then we identify our priorities and the resources that are required and assign responsibilities to individuals. So you know exactly what individuals will do when a disaster hits and they're employed. We also ensure that we collect reports of missing persons, losses and damages of all, whatever is reported during the disaster. We make sure that we, you correlate that information and then you pass it on to the management, NEMA. We engage in simulation exercises to flesh out various scenarios that can emerge from a disaster, and then also identify our vulnerabilities and the gaps so that we can correct them and train for them prior to the actual disaster, hitting the Federation. And we design initial clearance and disaster debris collection and disposal plan. Also identify persons that will be utilized for, search, and also the necessary resources, vehicles, and etc. And our responsibilities, in preparations, is integrated into the entire national disaster plan. So we also, liaise with other subcommittees, so that, like I said, our responsibilities are not just clear-cut or exhaustive. Sometimes they overlap and interact. Now, during disaster, I'm sure you are aware, and the general public is aware, that the only agency that is out there, the main agency that is out there during disaster impact, is the Defense Force. We ensure that the personnel are well equipped to go around and ensure, they keep eyes out on, critical infrastructure and look out for, lives that might be vulnerable as well. Okay, so, but during the disaster, we ensure that, personnel, vehicles, and all the equipment that we need are ready and good to go. Once weather permits, then we send people out. Now, post-disaster is what you just touched on, where we'll be able to give advice to the management committee that we think it is safe enough for people to go out of their homes, and all the power lines are either disconnected or they've been removed, and so forth, because part of the composition of a search, rescue, and initial clearance subcommittee is SCELIC. So we go out with them and we ensure that. So generally we do that, and then also the roads, we're able to advise the management committee on access roads and how safe they are, and and then also make suggestions for alternative routes in case of an access road has been severely damaged. A good example was when, I think it was 2017, it's Marion in Old Road. Soldiers were there first, and that is why we did not have, because they were going around during the disaster and so on. They noticed that there was this big hole in the road, so they had to park the vehicle across and try to find objects that can be used to, that is bright enough to warn road users that it's danger over there. Because otherwise, people would have been driving, trying to get home to safety, and then they get in there. So that is, so our responsibilities are, categorized into the pre-disaster, which entails the preparedness, training, and gathering of the equipment, resources that is required. And then during disaster is when we actually go into action. Everybody's mobilized before, and then they go into action. And they remain mobilized until after. And then when the all clear is given, and then we also get into helping to recover, properties that are not properly, totally damaged, making properties safe for people to go back to, and things like that, or help with ensuring that the shelters are habitable, because shelters also get damaged during disasters. So we try to help with that. And we have adequate resources in that regard, because Public Works is also part of the initial, the Search Rescue and Initial Clearance Committee. So they come with all their, equipment and the personnel, the technical people as well. And we collect from NEEM, SCELEC, the Defense Force, Customs, everybody. It's all hands on deck. Yeah, so.
We are going to go to the phone lines and hear what questions they may have, or whatever comments they may have. The numbers to call are 466-2666. That is 466-2666. The landline. You have two cell numbers, 662-8674, 662-8674, 767-4765, 767-4765, and 1-239-645-4500. 1-239-645-4500. That is the overseas number. We welcome your calls. Mrs. Petty, I began by saying that NEMA deals with comprehensive disaster management, that it is not just about hurricanes. We have to think in terms of tsunamis, we have to think in terms of earthquakes. How ready are we in terms of tsunamis and earthquakes, if such, God forbid, were to happen?
So, sorry. So St. Kitts and Nevis became tsunami ready recognized in October 2016. In fact, we are up for renewal this year and are actually approaching the date of renewal. And they were tsunami ready recognized by UNESCO Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. And to be tsunami ready recognized, we had to put a few things in place, and this includes a 24/7 tsunami warning focal point, and for that here in the Federation, that's 911. And so 911 receives information from the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, the PTWC, and sometimes it's just a test message, other times it's a message to say that there was an earthquake of this such and such magnitude. And so after 911 would have received that message, then they contact the Tsunami National Contact, and that is the National Disaster Coordinator, Abdia Samuel, as well as the Deputy National Disaster Coordinator, who they also contact, along with the 24/7 tsunami warning focal point. We also had to have the tsunami Indonesian maps readily available for the public, and I'm happy to say that we have those. In fact, they are also up for revision this year. And the tsunami evacuation maps, our worst case scenario of a 30-meter wave, 100-foot wave, and this is actually worst case scenario. And if you look at the map, the yellow would indicate the indonation of such a wave, and then the red circles are actually assembly points, and that's another thing that we have to put in place to be tsunami ready recognized, to have various assembly points throughout the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis. And an assembly point is chosen based on the capacity of that given community, as well as it has to be a space that is accessible 24/7, as well as government owned. And so there are some things that we take in consideration when we identify assembly points. Of course, if you look at the map, you may wonder where is your assembly point within your given area. But if you go into your actual district, and your district is whichever constituency you reside in, then you should be able to see where your assembly point is, as well as if you would have seen the signs around the island. And that's another thing that we had to put in place. We had to have some signage to indicate the tsunami hazard zones, as well as the assembly points that would say wait for official all clear. And an assembly point, of course, is there for us to give official information whether you need to move further inland or if the threat has passed. Another thing that we had to put in place was the standard operating procedures for tsunami. The standard operating procedures speaks to the actions taken before and during. So basically, it's a guiding document for stakeholders, one of the stakeholders being the Search and Rescue National Disaster Subcommittee. In fact, all of the National Disaster Subcommittees are included in this guiding document, and it's to guide in terms of from the time that we get a tsunami warning message and the actions taken after that. Because, a tsunami, unlike a hurricane, gives you little or no warning. It can be minutes, it can be hours.
Right. A tsunami is basically produced by an underwater earthquake. Isn't that what?
It can be an earthquake of a magnitude of 6.5 or higher, but there has to be some sort of shifting. And as I said, it has to be a magnitude of 6.5 or higher. It also can be caused by landslides, volcanic eruptions, because we do have a volcano under the sea. And some of the signs that you have to look out for tsunami is a strong earthquake of 6.5 magnitude or higher lasting for a long time. If you see the sea receding, you don't go out and be, all curious, taking pictures or picking up the fish that may appear after the sea have receded. Or if you hear a loud roaring sound, because with that body of water, of course, there's going to be a sound. And, you run. You don't walk briskly. You don't wait for officials to say you need to evacuate. If you know the signs, you know that you are in a tsunami hazard zone, and you see all these signs, then you head to the designated safe areas that would have been identified by the agency, and you wait for official messaging. So you feel, see, hear, run. That's the messaging that we always give when we go out to educate persons.
Okay. Now, in terms of an earthquake, I've often heard the DCH. Yes. Tell us a little, a bit about the earthquake preparedness checklist. What was some of the things that people should know?
Well, for an earthquake is a bit more difficult to prepare for, because an earthquake can happen at any minute. But it's important to know the DCH, drop, cover, hold on. If the earth starts to shake, and you can either go under a sturdy table, if one's available to you. You stand in the doorway and there's a correct positioning for that, or you hold on to something that's sturdy. And some of the things that you can do to prepare, mitigate impact of an earthquake would be fastening cabinets, televisions, anything that you know could fall down, possibly fall down and injure you within your home and workplace. You fasten them to the wall. You also don't just run around if you feel the earth shaking. You do the DCH, and then after, if it's deemed safe to do so, after you do your visual checks and you make sure that the doorway is clear, you head outside because you do not know if the building would collapse. And then you wait for the teams to actually go in and check to make sure that the integrity of the building was not compromised during the earthquake.
Right. Now, again, we are dealing with, Mrs. Petty, we are dealing with vulnerable areas, we are dealing with vulnerable groups, because with an earthquake, if people live in structures that are not strong, structures that are weak, then an earthquake can have more devastating impact on such persons. And then again, with tsunamis, the importance of understanding that we are small islands, and most of our villages are coastal, which means that a tsunami can have a devastating impact on these islands. We are very, very small. So again, people who live along the coast are very, very vulnerable in terms of the tsunami. Where do we run to? Do you run to the mountains?
You go to higher ground. As I said, the map shows you where these deemed safe areas are. And its worst case scenario, it's of a 30-meter wave or 100-foot wave, and that's worst case scenario, as it's never occurred before in history. Not that it couldn't occur, but we always like to do worst safe scenarios. And as I said, at these assembly points, the importance of them falls into if, for example, the estimated wave height is even larger than we would have estimated, then we will be able to tell you that you need to move further inland. And so I would say the most important thing for you to know is where your hazard zones are. And not just for where you live, but also where you work, for the entire island, because you do not know where you would be when a tsunami hits. Because we don't just stay at home. And a tsunami can also hit in the night. And so it could hit in the night, it could even hit right now while we're here. And so, as I said, it's important to know and familiarize yourself with the map, not when you get a warning, but before.
Sure.
It's important what Ms. Petty just touched on, especially when you're talking about tsunami. When the public education is given to the different communities, it is important that people take note, because just paying attention to the information, getting the education about these disasters and their intensity and their destructive power, also the mitigating factors, which one of the mitigating factors is identifying safe zones within the communities that will be communicated to the inhabitants of the community. And now, if you know and you participate in those public educations that NEMA runs from time to time, then it becomes like second nature pretty much. When something happens, you don't have to think to say, oh, where is the safe zone in my area? You already know, because you've been participating and you've been attending and taking note. And if I visit the area, you might have queries about how to access it, and so on, and voice it out, and probably some repairs or whatever can be made to those areas so that it becomes habitable to people. Because tsunamis, when they hit, I mean, we remember the Indonesian, the Bali. It was Bali, isn't it? Bali, Indonesia. Yeah.
There was a very deadly one somewhere in Japan, some years ago.
And then talking about the wave height and so forth. But at least you make the effort to get to safe grounds. You might not get there, or you might get there and get washed, but it's worth trying rather than not trying at all. If you look at the map, most of Bastia is below sea level when if you have a tsunami. So like, say for example, a tsunami hits here, I know, the tsunami hits now, I know the safe zone, the area that we're supposed to be is right behind the airport there.
Yes.
So, you just make it there, as quickly as possible. And then you might stand, a chance to stay alive. So it is important that we know these things, and we know, we acquire this information and, rationalize it, utilize it, rather than just think about, oh, I want to secure my home, because your home is not going to be of use to you when, such happens. Look at what happened in St. Vincent recently. I mean, a lot of people didn't want to leave their home. The same thing happened in Montserrat when they had the earthquake there. People thought that, they spent all their life savings in their home. They didn't want to leave. A few people were buried in the lava flow and things like that. So if we want to save life, we should listen to the information. And if we have questions, question the authorities that are responsible before, because you don't know when, these disasters could hit.
So much of responding to disasters and preparing for disasters has to do with awareness. Yes. Awareness is crucial. And that awareness, as you correctly said, Mrs. Petty, is tied to the geography. Understanding basically where you are located in terms of maps, where you are in the place in the world, and knowing what some of those hazards are in that particular geographic area.
Yes, and if I may follow up to what Major Sutton just said, knowing where your assembly point is not just knowing, it's knowing how long it takes you to get there. And so you could do it as an exercise when you come home from work, you and your family, you just, you take a stroll to your identified assembly point within your community, you time yourself, okay, it took us 2 minutes, 3 minutes to get there. And so, you familiarize yourself, you do drills with your family. You tell them, oh, a tsunami is coming, we need to go. You see how long it takes you to evacuate your home and gather. And of course, after you evacuate your home or business, you make sure that everyone is accounted for, because accountability is one of the most important things. You do not want to be at the assembly point and then realize that you're missing 1 or 2 persons. And so we always tell persons when we go to educate and do drills, because we do drills with businesses as well as the schools, that before you actually go to your assembly area, you muster outside the building, you count to make sure that everyone's accounted for, and then you head to safety.
Right. Now, in terms of you mentioned family, and I'm happy that you did. What is the importance of having a family emergency communication plan with respect to disasters?
It is very important. I think we take for granted our cell phones. We always assume that we will be able to contact each other in the event of an emergency, but sometimes we have to realize that after impact, these amenities that we become so accustomed to may not even be available, and so you need to have backup. Okay, so cell phone towers are down, and so we will meet at such and such area at such and such time. or you know that you can contact someone, maybe you have a relationship with someone with a radio, I don't know. You can contact that person, and then, we know who to go to just to make sure that each other are safe. And so you have that backup communication plan in case your cell phone goes down. And I've been in situations where I've not had cell service for a long while, and it wasn't in fact, I was off island during the impact of Hurricane Irma, and I was not able to communicate with my family back in St. Kitts for a few days, and that in itself was challenging. And so I can tell you firsthand the importance of having a backup communication plan.
Right. Now, hurricanes and hurricane preparedness, that is the season that we're in at this time, the hurricane season. Now, what are some hurricane preparedness tips, or let us look at the hurricane preparedness checklist, or what are some of those activities in terms of hurricane preparedness that the agency is involved in at this time, especially with respect to your role at NEMA, Mrs. Petty?
Okay. As I mentioned earlier, I'm the liaison officer between the agency and the National Disaster Subcommittees. And so a part of that includes making sure that these subcommittees stand ready to respond to an impact of a tropical cyclone. And that includes meeting with their subcommittee members to make sure that their members are prepared and are going to debate the annual preparedness exercises. There are some subcommittees that have special preparedness activities that they have to do each year, and some of those would include, of course, all of them have to update their plans, but the transport list, doing the baseline measurements for the beaches, and that's the responsibility of the Environment National Disaster Subcommittee. The shelter list, having the shelters identified, inspected, and then approved. And so that falls also under my responsibility in terms of making sure that these annual preparedness activities are carried out. Another thing that falls under preparedness is to make sure that these subcommittees are tested, and we do that in various ways: tabletop exercise, even a simple communication exercise of such, which was actually done last week, where I contacted the various chairs of the National Disaster Subcommittees and timed them to see how long it took them to respond to an emergency message, and the action required was just for them to acknowledge that they received the message. And so that just forms a part of the preparedness activities. It just makes sure that they're kept on their toes. They know that they can be activated at any minute to respond to any potential impact.
Okay, Mrs. Petty, children are often very vulnerable when it comes to disasters. What is being done to sensitize, to help with awareness, preparation, especially when it comes to children?
Okay, so the agency actually forms a part of the Model School Safety Program. And the Model School Safety Program entails that school children are prepared for all hazards. So we do practice comprehensive disaster management even at the primary and high school level. And so you would find that we often do evacuation drills with schools. I think the last one we did was earlier in the year. We have not been able to do as much evacuation drills as we normally would have because, of course, of COVID, but we do information sessions with the schools, as well as assist them in doing the emergency plans. And these emergency plans, of course, include the protection of the school children, because you would want to know that whatever school you're sending your child to has prepared for any eventuality. And so sometimes you can actually tell the results by just asking your child, what is a tsunami, or do you know where your safe zone is? And you may not know, but they may be able to tell you. And we've had stories where parents would come back and say, oh, my child came home and said, oh, my mommy, you know where our assembly point is. And, you know, they would be able to tell the parent that we learned it in school and they had an evacuation drill. And so then it starts a conversation between the parents who may not know. And so they may reach out, they may look at NEMA.kn, which is our website, and realize that, oh, okay, so this is what you do at school and it's important to know. And so we use our children as well to educate the public, because, you know, when children get home from school, they will tell you everything that happened. And so it's very effective.
Now, thank you, Mrs. Petty. Major Sutton, what tips or what advice would you give to persons to be safe after a disaster, whether it be a hurricane, an earthquake, a tsunami? What are some of the tips that you would give to people? Because then you have collapsed buildings. For example, we saw what happened in Florida some time ago. A building just collapsed like that. I would not have liked to be in that building. But what are some of the tips you would give to people?
It's, you know, in following up with what Ms. Petier spoke about, it's important, like, to take the awareness program seriously. And we always have this PSA that go out during a hurricane, when, you know, a hurricane is imminent, hurricane impact is imminent, or prior to. NEMA always, you know, periodically or consistently, I should say, you know, send out messages, and they give all the warnings, they give all the advices, and so forth. I think if people take those warnings and advices into consideration and act upon them, people will be safe. We also try to drive around sometimes with the loud hailers on our vehicles, mounted on our vehicles, or you know, try to give information to the general public, both in Spanish and in English sometimes. If people listen to those instructions and warnings, you know, people will be safe, because it's all the information and the warnings are designed to help to save life. When we say, you know, stay at home, you don't come out during the impact of the hurricane, you have wind speed of this, and, you know, rain is falling, and then you find people out there. There's a lot of flying debris. You know, you find glass, you find roofing sheets, you find metals, pieces of vehicles, and so, you know, all sorts of old things are flying around the place, and this could cause serious bodily injuries to persons. So a lot of times we are out there and we find persons who have not yielded to those instructions. We help to keep them safe and take them to the police station so that they can hold them there. And also all the safety tips, you know, in hurricane preparedness and other disaster preparedness, like the dock, hold, and DHL, DCH, and also, you know, for the tsunami, feel, see, hear, and run. You know, you adhere to all those warnings and instructions and act upon them, you stand a better chance of staying alive.
Yes. No, I am the chair of the Education, Warning, and Communication Committee. And one of the things that in disaster management that we have to contend with is that we live in an age of misinformation and disinformation. We are seeing it with the COVID-19 pandemic. It has been rife, the disinformation and misinformation. Now, misinformation is simply inaccurate information. But disinformation has an intent to it, a malicious intent. It is designed basically to mislead people And in doing so, what you're doing is that you're creating another disaster. And misinformation and disinformation can create other disasters within a disaster. And we are seeing it with the COVID-19 pandemic, the lot of misinformation, disinformation that is out there on the pandemic itself, and in addition to the whole area of vaccination and the vaccines. And it is important that people get information from official sources. They should turn to official sources for information. Information should also be verified. You verify information, you verify the sources. You just don't take something that comes to you because Tom, Dick, or Harry said it. You have to look at the credibility of the information. And so therefore, NEMA is the official agency when it comes to disaster management. We look at official institutions, for example, the St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service, which I lead, is the official information source of the government. No other Facebook page or anything like that is the official source of the government when it comes to information. We have the St. Kitts and Nevis Defense Force. They're the official. The Royal St. Christopher and Nevis Police Force, they're official. When people come to you and give you information that is not from an official source, you must question that information. We live in a society today that, especially with the advent of the cell phone, which is a very good thing, but sometimes the way that it is being used is not such a very good thing. We have the cell phone, we have the internet, we have internet on phones, the WhatsApp and the Facebook Messenger and all of that, and people putting a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. And we have to be able to think critically, to read critically, to listen critically, and to verify information, to check sources, to check reliability of information, validity of information, and so on. We just do not run with everything that we hear, because then eventually that works to our detriment. And so it is with the disaster preparedness, which we have been talking about today. It is important that people get information from official sources. We cannot underscore that point enough. The St. Kitts Met Office is where you get the weather update. You don't get it from somebody on the street. And if somebody on the street come and tell you, boy, look, we're having a flood later, you know, your first question to them would be, where did you get that information? Or where can I find that information? Or if somebody comes to you and tell you something about the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccines and all of that sort of a thing, my question to them is, can you show me the data? Can you present me with the information? Where did you get it? Just don't be gullible and believe stuff, because then we are creating other disasters. Mrs. Petty, I think you would agree with me.
Of course.
And there is nothing worse than when people do not listen to the warnings and disregard official communication and all of that. What eventually happens is that you are working against yourself.
And you also put the first responders who have to rescue you in danger. Yeah.
Yes.
Following the instructions is critical. It makes the response more effective. You don't utilize resources, waste resources that is, limited, to do what you need to do and save lives and property.
But the more educated we are in terms of disaster preparedness, is the more aware we are. And education, awareness, has to do with then, it means then that we would prepare ourselves for the eventuality of anything. Disasters can happen at any time. Look at what happened the other day in Germany and in Belgium and in the Netherlands with this flooding. And it seems like they were caught unawares. So these things can come upon us at any time, but at the very same time, the more prepared we are, is the better prepared we are to respond and to mitigate against the destruction that disasters can cause to property, to life, to animals, and all of that. Mrs. Petty, is it true that with a tsunami, that animals, I've heard, sense and start to run? Do they sense something before human beings do? Do they have that sense when there's a...
I don't think it's just tsunamis. I think it's everything. I remember my mom sharing the story of, a story that her mom told her that before some earthquake some years ago we had in St. Kitts, she remembered the dogs barking non-stop, and she couldn't figure out why they kept barking and they were pulling on their chains, and it was only after the earthquake happened that she realized that it was a warning. And so, there are some natural warnings that we have to look out for, and don't forget, animals always have a sixth sense about these things, not just for tsunamis, even for hurricanes. I don't know if you've ever realized before an impact of a storm, if you look at the skies, you'd wonder where the birds. Before the impact of Irma, I remember clearly there were no birds for a few days, and it took them a few days after that to return, and then they disappeared again because of Maria. And so these are some things that the older persons in the community would tell you that, that's a sign that something is coming. And I'm sure if you go even to the fishermen, they would be able to tell you some more signs that we may not even know, because they have their eyes and ears down in the community. So they should be able to tell you at this certain time, a storm is coming because such and such.
Yes, because nature in some way has its own reasoning. And so this thing basically comes into play, is coordinated. The environment has a lot to teach us. And if we really pay attention to the environment, to natural life as it is, we will learn a lot. But sometimes when we are not paying attention to the environment, and we are destroying the environment, and we are treating the environment poorly, then the environment comes back to treat us poorly. And that is what we are seeing. This is not a discussion on climate change and what is happening in terms of, the more severe storms and so on we are seeing, but it is as a result of that. So there has to be somehow care for the environment. Care for the environment. That's a whole different topic in itself. But we are out of time, and I just want to give you a minute to wrap up, to say what you would like to say before we end. Ms. Petty.
Well, thank you for having me on the program. I must say it was a good discussion. To the general public, if you have not started your annual preparedness activities or you haven't done ever before your any preparedness activities for the hurricane season. We are approaching the peak of the hurricane season, which is mid-August, and so when you as you approach the peak, you may see an increase in activity. And so if you have not started your preparedness, don't wait until it's too late. Don't wait until you get the alert that says that a storm is on its way to St. Kitts and Nevis to go stand in the long lines at the supermarkets. Start preparing now. If you're not financially able to have a 3-day food stock at once, what you can do is weekly or monthly, you set aside 1 can, 2 cans, 3 cans of whatever non-perishable food items that you purchase. So you may not be able to do it one time, but you can gradually build up to that 3 days of food stock.
Major Coyote?
I would like to reiterate that we listen to the instructions, the warnings, and adhere to them, and also not to be selfish with our preparedness actions. Just like Ms. Petty mentioned, some families might not have it to be able to, prepare, have enough stock to last them 3 days. If you know that you have it and your neighbors don't have it, you reach out to them and help. We're all in this together.
Right. Thank you to both of you. Mrs. Ulrika Lennon-Petty, Planning Officer at NEMA, and Major Coyote Sutton, Chair of the Search, Rescue, and Initial Clearance Subcommittee. It has been a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to Working for You today. Of course, we continue to appreciate your company from week to week. Next week, we'll be back with another Working for You program. Until then, take good care. I am Les Roy Williams.